When a dedicated emergency room nurse was fired for saving a Navy captain's life by breaking hospital protocol, no one could have predicted that 24 hours later, she would receive a phone call that would change everything. What happened next at the White House left everyone speechless. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The fluorescent lights of Mercy General Hospital's emergency room cast their familiar harsh glow across the polished linoleum floors as Maria Rodriguez adjusted her scrubs for what felt like the 100th time that shift. At 34, she had been working as an emergency room nurse for 8 years, but tonight felt different. There was an electricity in the air, the kind that seasoned medical professionals learn to recognize as a harbinger of chaos. Friday. Nights in San Diego were notorious for bringing in everything the city could throw at them. But Maria had developed an intuition about which shifts would test her limits. Her dark hair was pulled back in a tight ponytail, secured with the same elastic band she had been using for 3 weeks because replacing it meant another expense she couldn't afford right now. The small apartment she shared with her 8-year-old son Tommy was already stretching her budget thin, and the student loans from nursing school seemed to grow larger every month despite her faithful payments. But Maria had never been one to complain. She had learned early in life that survival meant keeping your head down, working hard, and never expecting anyone to hand you anything. The emergency room was already buzzing with activity, even though her shift had just begun. Maria could hear the familiar sounds that had become the soundtrack of her adult life: monitors beeping in steady rhythms, the squeak of gurney wheels against linoleum, muffled conversations between doctors and residents, and the occasional burst of urgent voices. When a critical case arrived, she loved this chaos in a way that surprised people who knew her quiet demeanor outside of work. Here, in the middle of medical emergencies and life or death decisions, Maria felt most like herself. Lisa Chun, her closest friend and fellow nurse, appeared beside her with 2 steaming cups of coffee from the break room machine. The coffee was terrible, but it was free and strong enough to keep them alert through another long night. Lisa had been working at Mercy General for almost as long as Maria, and the 2 women had developed the kind of friendship that emerges between people who have seen each other handle the worst moments of human experience with grace and competence. "You look tired before we've even started," Lisa observed, handing Maria one of the cups. "Tommy keeping you up again?" Maria smiled despite her exhaustion. Her son had been having nightmares lately, something about monsters hiding in his closet that no amount of logical explanation could dispel. She had spent most of the previous night sitting beside his bed, reading stories and checking the closet repeatedly until he finally fell asleep around 3 in the morning. Then she had gotten up at 6 to get him ready for school before her shift. "He's going through a phase," Maria replied, taking the grateful sip of the bitter coffee. "Dr. Harrison wants to see me in his office before rounds. Any idea what that's about?" Lisa's expression darkened slightly. Dr. Robert Harrison was the hospital administrator, a man in his 50s who had never worked directly with patients, but wielded considerable power over the nursing staff. He was known for his rigid adherence to hospital policies and procedures, often prioritizing administrative concerns over what the nurses considered practical patient care. Maria had managed to avoid any significant conflicts with him during her tenure, but she had witnessed him discipline other nurses for infractions that seemed minor compared to the life-saving work they performed daily. "Probably just some new paperwork requirement or policy update," Lisa said, though her tone suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. "You know how he loves his meetings." Maria nodded, but something in her stomach twisted with apprehension. She had been working double shifts more frequently lately, partly because of the overtime pay and partly because they were consistently understaffed. The hospital had been cutting costs wherever possible, which usually meant expecting the existing staff to handle increasingly heavy workloads. Maria wondered if Dr. Harrison had noticed her overtime hours and intended to discuss budget constraints. The automatic doors at the emergency room entrance whooshed open with their characteristic sound, and Maria's attention shifted to the incoming ambulance crew. Paramedics were wheeling in what appeared to be a middle-aged man on a stretcher, his face pale and his breathing labored. Even from across the room, Maria could see the organized urgency in the paramedics' movements that indicated a serious case. 47-year-old male, multiple trauma from motor vehicle accident, the lead paramedic called out as they approached the triage area. Possible internal bleeding, blood pressure dropping, pulse rapid and thready. ADA from scene was 12 minutes. Dr. Sandra Kim, the attending physician on duty, quickly assessed the situation and directed the patient toward Trauma Bay 2. Maria followed automatically, her personal concerns about the meeting with Dr. Harrison temporarily forgotten in the face of immediate medical need. This was what she had trained for, what she was good at, and what made all the exhaustion and financial stress worthwhile. As they transferred the patient from the ambulance stretcher to the hospital bed, Maria got her first clear look at him. Despite his injuries and the pallor of shock, there was something about his bearing that suggested military training. His haircut was precise, his posture maintained even in unconsciousness, and when her eyes caught sight of the dog tags around his neck, the impression was confirmed. Military? Dr. Kim asked, noticing the same details. Navy Captain James Mitchell, the paramedic confirmed, consulting his notes, was returning from a meeting at the Naval Medical Center when the accident occurred. Multiple car collision, his vehicle took the worst impact. Maria began attaching monitoring equipment with practiced efficiency while Dr. Kim performed her initial examination. The captain's vital signs were concerning but not immediately critical, though Maria's experience told her that could change rapidly with internal injuries. She had learned to trust her instincts about patients, and something about Captain Mitchell's condition made her uneasy in a way that went beyond the obvious trauma. I need a complete blood panel, chest x-rays, and let's get him prepped for a CT scan, Dr. Kim ordered. Maria, can you get N4 started and begin fluid replacement? Maria was already reaching for the necessary supplies before Dr. Kim finished speaking. She had developed an anticipatory awareness during emergency situations that allowed her to stay several steps ahead of the immediate requirements. As she searched for a suitable vein in Captain Mitchell's arm, she noticed his eyes flutter open. Briefly, for just a moment, their gazes met, and she saw something in his expression that reminded her of Tommy during his worst nightmares. Fear mixed with a determination not to show it. "You're going to be okay," she told him quietly, her voice carrying the calm authority she had perfected over years of comforting frightened patients. "We're taking good care of you." Captain Mitchell tried to speak, but Dr. Kim placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Don't try to talk right now. We need to run some tests and see what we're dealing with. Just focus on breathing." The next hour passed in the controlled chaos that Maria had learned to navigate with professional competence. Captain Mitchell's condition stabilized somewhat after the fluid replacement, but the CT scan revealed internal bleeding that would require immediate surgical intervention. The problem was that their trauma surgeon was currently in another emergency surgery that could last several more hours, and the nearest hospital with an available trauma team was over 30 minutes away by ambulance. Maria watched Dr. Kim struggle with the decision while Captain Mitchell's blood pressure readings continued to decline despite their interventions. She had seen this situation before, and she knew that sometimes the difference between life and death came down to minutes or even seconds. The captain needed surgery now, not in 2 hours when their surgeon became available or 45 minutes after an ambulance transfer to another facility. That was when Dr. Harrison appeared in the trauma bay, having apparently heard about the high-profile patient through the hospital's communication network. Maria felt her stomach tighten as she watched. Kim assessed the situation with the calculating expression. She had learned to associate with administrative concerns rather than patient care priorities. "Dr. Kim, what's the status here?" Dr. Harrison asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "Internal bleeding requiring immediate surgical intervention," Dr. Kim replied without looking away from her patient. "Dr. Peterson is tied up for at least another hour, maybe 2. I'm considering transfer to Presbyterian." Dr. Harrison nodded slowly, and Maria could practically see him weighing the hospital's liability concerns against the patient's medical needs. "That seems like the safest course of action. We don't want to exceed our capabilities." But as Dr. Harrison spoke, Captain Mitchell's monitor began alarming with increasing urgency. His blood pressure was dropping faster than their current interventions could compensate for, and Maria realized with growing certainty that he wouldn't survive. A transfer to another hospital. She had seen enough patients in similar conditions to recognize the signs of impending cardiovascular collapse. "Dr. Kim," Maria said quietly, her voice carrying an urgency that made both the doctor and Dr. Harrison look at her. "His pressures dropping too fast for transfer. Look at his numbers." Dr. Kim glanced at the monitors, and Maria saw her expression change as she reached the same conclusion. The captain was running out of time, and the decision about his care had just become much more immediate and critical. "We need to move him to surgery now," Dr. Kim said firmly. "I can handle the procedure. Maria, prep OR3 and call anesthesia." But Dr. Harrison stepped forward, his expression hardening. "Dr. Kim, that's not our protocol. We have specific guidelines about procedures that exceed our department's designated capabilities. The liability issues alone." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Maria felt something surge inside her as she watched Dr. Harrison prioritize hospital policies over a patient's life. She had spent 8 years following protocols and procedures, but she had also learned to recognize when those same protocols became obstacles to providing the care that patients desperately needed. Captain Mitchell was going to die while they debated administrative concerns, and something in Maria's core refused to accept that outcome. "With respect, Dr. Harrison," Maria said, her voice steady but carrying an edge that surprised everyone in the room, including herself. "This man is going to die if we don't act right now. The protocols you're worried about don't matter if the patient doesn't survive." Dr. Harrison's face flushed with anger at being challenged by a nurse in front of other staff members. "Nurse Rodriguez, you're overstepping your bounds. Medical decisions are made by physicians and administrators, not nursing staff." But Maria was no longer listening to Dr. Harrison's concerns about hierarchy and procedure. She was watching Captain Mitchell's monitor displays and calculating how much time they had left before his condition became irreversible. Her years of experience in emergency medicine had taught her to recognize the critical moment when action became more important than authorization. "Dr. Kim," Maria said, turning away from Dr. Harrison entirely. "OR3 is ready. Anesthesia is standing by. We can have him prepped in 5 minutes." Dr. Kim looked between Maria and Dr. Harrison, clearly torn between following hospital protocol and responding to her medical instincts. But when Captain Mitchell's blood pressure alarm sounded again, the decision was made for her. "Let's move," Dr. Kim said, beginning to release the brakes on the captain's bed. "Maria, call ahead and make sure everything's ready." Dr. Harrison's voice rose with authority and anger. "Dr. Kim, I'm ordering you to stop this procedure." "Nurse Rodriguez, you're suspended immediately for insubordination. Security will escort you from the building." But Maria was already moving with the practiced efficiency that had defined her career. She knew that once Captain Mitchell was in surgery and stable, she would face the consequences of her actions. But right now, in this moment, a human being's life hung in the balance, and that was the only consideration that mattered to her. The next 30 minutes passed in a blur of surgical preparation and life-saving intervention. Maria assisted Dr. Kim with the precision and competence that had made her one of the most respected nurses in the emergency department, even as she knew that each action was solidifying her termination from the job she loved. But as Captain Mitchell's vital signs stabilized under their care, and as the internal bleeding was successfully controlled through emergency surgery, Maria felt a sense of professional satisfaction that no administrative policy could diminish. When security guards appeared in the surgical suite to escort her from the building, Maria quietly removed her scrubs and gathered her personal belongings from her locker. Lisa Chun met her at the staff exit, her eyes filled with tears and anger at the injustice of the situation. "This is insane," Lisa said, hugging her friend tightly. "You saved his life. Anyone with eyes could see that he wouldn't have survived a transfer." Maria managed a small smile despite the overwhelming weight of what had just happened. "I know, and I'd do it again." As she walked through the hospital parking lot toward her aging Honda Civic, Maria felt the strange mixture of pride and devastation that comes from doing the right thing at considerable personal cost. She had just lost the job that supported her and Tommy, the career she had worked so hard to build, and the professional identity that had given her life meaning and purpose. But Captain James Mitchell was alive, and sometimes that was the only measure that really mattered. The drive home through the empty San Diego streets felt surreal, as if Maria was moving through someone else's life rather than her own. The dashboard clock glowed 3:47 a.m., and the city had settled into that peculiar quiet that exists only in the hours between midnight and dawn. Streetlights cast long shadows across deserted intersections, and the occasional late-night delivery truck rumbled past her aging Honda Civic as she navigated the familiar route from Mercy General Hospital to the small apartment complex where she and Tommy had lived for the past 3 years. Maria's hands gripped the steering wheel with unnecessary force, her knuckles white against the worn plastic. The adrenaline from the evening's events was beginning to fade, replaced by a crushing awareness of what had just transpired. She had lost her job. Not just any job, but the career she had sacrificed everything to build. The profession that had given her life purpose and direction since she graduated from nursing school 8 years ago. The weight of that reality pressed against her chest like a physical force, making it difficult to breathe normally. She thought about Tommy sleeping peacefully in his bed, unaware that his mother's world had just been turned upside down. How was she going to explain this to him? How was she going to tell her 8-year-old son that she no longer had the job that paid for their small apartment, his school supplies, and the modest life they had managed to build together? Tommy had never known his father, who had disappeared before he was born, leaving Maria to navigate single motherhood while pursuing her nursing degree through a combination of student loans, part-time work, and sheer determination. The apartment complex where they lived was nothing special, but it had represented stability and progress for Maria. The 2-bedroom unit on the second floor was clean and safe, with a small balcony that overlooked a playground where Tommy spent hours after school. The rent was manageable on her nursing salary, and the location allowed Tommy to attend a decent elementary school within walking distance. Now, with her termination from Mercy General, all of that security felt as fragile as tissue paper. Maria parked in her assigned space and sat in the car for several minutes, staring up at the darkened windows of their apartment. The building was quiet except for the distant hum of air conditioning units and the occasional sound of a car passing on the street beyond the complex. She had always found something comforting about returning home after a difficult shift, knowing that Tommy was safe upstairs and that her work had made a difference in people's lives. Tonight, that comfort felt hollow and unreachable. The babysitter, Mrs. Chun from downstairs, had left a note on the kitchen table indicating that Tommy had completed his homework, eaten dinner, and gone to bed without any problems. Maria folded the note carefully and placed it in the small wooden box where she kept important papers. Though she wondered how many more nights she would be able to afford babysitting services, Mrs. Chun was kind and charged reasonable rates. But even small expenses would become impossible if Maria couldn't find new employment quickly. She checked on Tommy, pushing his bedroom door open just enough to see his small form curled under his superhero comforter. His breathing was deep and regular, and for a moment, Maria felt her heart rate slow as she watched the gentle rise and fall of his chest. Whatever happened next, she had to protect Tommy from the worst consequences of her decision. He deserved stability and security, even if her own professional life had just imploded. Maria made her way to her own bedroom, where she sat on the edge of the bed still wearing her street clothes. Sleep felt impossible, but she was too emotionally drained to do anything productive. Instead, she found herself replaying the events of the evening, analyzing each decision and wondering if she could have handled the situation differently. Could she have found a way to save Captain Mitchell's life without directly defying Dr. Harrison? Could she have been more diplomatic in her approach while still advocating for the patient's immediate needs? But even as she questioned her methods, Maria knew she couldn't regret the core decision she had made. Captain Mitchell was alive because she had chosen to prioritize his medical needs over hospital protocol. She had seen too many patients suffer or die because of administrative delays and bureaucratic concerns, to accept that his life should be sacrificed for the sake of institutional liability management. Her nursing training had taught her to assess, prioritize, and act in the best interests of patient care, and that was exactly what she had done. The next morning arrived with Tommy's alarm clock buzzing at 7:30, followed by the familiar sounds of her son moving around his room as he prepared for school. Maria had managed perhaps 2 hours of restless sleep, but she forced herself to get up and maintain their normal routine. Tommy couldn't know yet that everything had changed. She needed time to figure out her next steps before she disrupted his sense of security. "Mom, did you work really late last night?" Tommy asked as he appeared in the kitchen wearing his school uniform and carrying his backpack. His dark hair stuck up at odd angles despite her attempts to teach him proper grooming habits, and there was a small stain on his shirt that she pretended not to notice. "Just a busy shift," Maria replied, pouring orange juice into his favorite cup. "How did you sleep? Any more bad dreams?" Tommy shook his head as he climbed onto his chair at their small kitchen table. "Mrs. Chun helped me check the closet before bed. She said monsters are afraid of flashlights, so we left mine on the nightstand just in case." Maria smiled despite her exhaustion and worry. Mrs. Chun had a gift for understanding children's fears and finding practical solutions that made sense to an 8-year-old mind. That was smart thinking. Mrs. Chun knows a lot about keeping monsters away. As Tommy ate his breakfast cereal, Maria went through the motions of their morning routine while her mind raced through practical concerns. How long would her savings last without her nursing salary? What were her options for finding new employment in San Diego's competitive healthcare market? Would other hospitals be willing to hire her after her termination from Mercy General, especially if Dr. Harrison provided a negative reference? The more she considered her situation, the more overwhelming it became. Healthcare was a relatively small community in any city, and news of her confrontation with hospital administration would likely spread quickly among potential employers. Even if other nursing directors sympathized with her position, they might be reluctant to hire someone with a documented history of challenging administrative authority. After Tommy left for school, Maria sat at her laptop and began researching her options. The job market for experienced emergency room nurses was generally strong, but most positions required positive references from previous employers. She could probably find work at smaller clinics or private practices, but those positions typically paid significantly less than hospital nursing and often lacked the benefits she needed as a single mother. Her phone rang around 10:30, startling her from her research. The caller ID showed Lisa Chun's number, and Maria answered immediately, grateful for any connection to the professional world she had just lost. "Maria, how are you holding up?" Lisa's voice carried the concern and anger that Maria had expected from her closest friend at the hospital. "I'm trying to figure out what comes next," Maria replied honestly. "Have you heard anything about Captain Mitchell? Is he okay?" "He's stable and recovering well. Dr. Kim said the surgery was successful, and his prognosis is excellent." "You saved his life, Maria. Everyone knows that." Maria felt relief wash over her at the news of Captain Mitchell's recovery, but it was quickly followed by renewed frustration at the circumstances of her termination. "I'm glad he's going to be okay. That's what matters." "Dr. Harrison called a staff meeting this morning," Lisa continued, her voice growing harder. "He used your situation as an example of why we need to follow protocols exactly, regardless of circumstances." It was disgusting, Maria. Half the nursing staff wanted to walk out. The news that Dr. Harrison was using her termination as a teaching moment felt like salt in an open wound, but Maria wasn't entirely surprised. He had always been more concerned with institutional control than patient advocacy, and her direct challenge to his authority had probably threatened his sense of administrative power. "What did Dr. Kim say?" Maria asked, curious about the physician who had ultimately supported her decision to proceed with emergency surgery. "She didn't attend the meeting, but I heard she submitted a formal report supporting your actions. She documented everything about Captain Mitchell's condition and why immediate surgery was medically necessary. She's furious about how you were treated." Maria appreciated Dr. Kim's support, but she doubted it would make any difference in terms of her employment status. Dr. Harrison had made his position clear, and hospital administrators typically supported each other's disciplinary decisions, regardless of the medical circumstances involved. The rest of the day passed slowly as Maria continued her job search and tried to calculate how long her savings would last. She had always been careful with money, but nursing school loans and the costs of raising Tommy as a single mother had prevented her from building substantial financial reserves. At best, she could cover their basic expenses for about 2 months, if she was extremely careful about spending. That evening, Tommy noticed her distraction during dinner and asked if something was wrong. Maria had planned to wait before discussing the situation with him, but his direct question caught her off guard. "I'm having some challenges at work," she said carefully, not wanting to lie but also not ready to explain the full extent of their situation. "I might need to look for a new job." Tommy's expression grew serious in the way that children's faces do when they sense adult problems that might affect their own security. "Are we going to have to move again?" The question broke Maria's heart because it revealed how much Tommy remembered about their earlier struggles. Before she had secured her position at Mercy General, they had moved several times as Maria searched for stable employment and affordable housing. Tommy had been younger then, but apparently old enough to remember the uncertainty and disruption. "I'm going to do everything I can to make sure we can stay here," Maria promised, reaching across the table to squeeze his hand. "You don't need to worry about that." But even as she spoke the words, Maria wondered if she could keep that promise. The healthcare job market was competitive, and her termination from Mercy General would complicate her search for comparable employment. She might have to consider positions outside of San Diego, which would mean uprooting Tommy from his school and friends once again. The weekend passed in a blur of job applications, online research, and attempts to maintain normalcy for Tommy's Saki. Maria applied for positions at every hospital and healthcare facility within a reasonable commuting distance, but she received few responses and no interview requests. The silence from potential employers was deafening and deeply discouraging. Monday morning brought unexpected developments that would change everything about Maria's situation, though she had no way of knowing it as she prepared another round of job applications. The first sign that something unusual was happening came in the form of a phone call from an unknown number with a Washington, D.C. area code. "Is this Maria Rodriguez?" The professional female voice asked when Maria answered. "Yes, this is Maria. How can I help you?" "Ms. Rodriguez, this is Sarah Thompson calling from the White House Personnel Office. I'm calling regarding your recent actions at Mercy General Hospital in San Diego. Would you have a few minutes to speak with me about what happened with Captain Mitchell?" Maria felt her heart rate accelerate as she processed what she was hearing. The White House was calling her about Captain Mitchell? How had they even learned about the situation? And why would federal government officials be interested in a local hospital employment matter? "I'm not sure what you want to know," Maria said carefully, suddenly aware that this conversation might have implications she couldn't anticipate. "Captain Mitchell is a highly respected naval officer who was returning from an important meeting at your local Naval Medical Center when his accident occurred," Sarah Thompson explained. "His commanding officers and Navy medical personnel have been briefed on the circumstances of his treatment at Mercy General. We understand that you took significant personal and professional risks to ensure he received immediate medical care." Maria sat down heavily in her kitchen chair, trying to process this unexpected development. "I just did what any nurse would do in that situation. Captain Mitchell needed emergency surgery, and we couldn't wait for a transfer to another facility. Ms. Rodriguez, we've received detailed reports from multiple sources about what happened that night. Dr. Kim submitted a comprehensive medical report documenting Captain Mitchell's condition and the time-sensitive nature of his treatment needs. We've also received statements from other hospital staff members who witnessed your advocacy for immediate patient care, despite direct orders from hospital administration. The realization that federal officials had been investigating the circumstances of her termination felt surreal and overwhelming." Maria had expected her confrontation with Dr. Harrison to remain a local hospital personnel matter, not something that would attract attention from Washington, D.C. "What does this mean?" Maria asked, though she wasn't sure she was ready for the answer. "Ms. Rodriguez, Captain Mitchell's life was saved because you chose to prioritize medical necessity over institutional protocol. Your actions exemplify the kind of courage and dedication that our military personnel encounter from civilian healthcare providers, and that service has not gone unnoticed at the highest levels of our government." Sarah Thompson paused, and Maria could hear papers rustling in the background as if she was consulting notes or documents. "Ms. Rodriguez, the President would like to personally recognize your service and sacrifice. We would like to invite you to a ceremony at the White House where you will be presented with the Presidential Citizen's Medal for your extraordinary commitment to saving Captain Mitchell's life, despite the personal and professional costs you incurred." Maria felt the room spinning around her as she tried to comprehend what she was hearing. The President of the United States wanted to give her a medal for doing her job as a nurse? The whole situation felt too impossible to be real. "I think there might be some mistake," Maria said weakly. "I'm just a nurse who lost her job for breaking hospital policy. I'm not a hero." "Ms. Rodriguez," Sarah Thompson's voice carried gentle firmness, "heroes rarely recognize themselves as such. Your willingness to risk your career and financial security to save a life exemplifies the highest ideals of civilian service to our military personnel. The President specifically wants to honor healthcare workers who go above and beyond their professional requirements to serve others." The conversation continued for another 10 minutes as Sarah Thompson explained the details of the White House ceremony and the arrangements that would be made for Maria's travel to Washington, D.C. As she hung up the phone, Maria stared at the notes she had scribbled during the call, still unable to fully believe what had just happened. Her life had gone from professional disaster to presidential recognition in the span of a single phone call. But more importantly, the federal attention on her situation meant that her actions at Mercy General were being viewed in an entirely different context. Instead of being seen as an insubordinate employee who had defied hospital authority, she was being recognized as a healthcare hero who had prioritized patient care over institutional politics. The implications for her future employment prospects were immediate and significant. Hospitals throughout the country would soon learn that the nurse who had been terminated by Mercy General was receiving presidential recognition for the same actions that had cost her job. The narrative around her professional standing was about to change dramatically. Maria walked to her bedroom and looked at herself in the mirror, trying to see the person that federal officials apparently saw when they looked at her case. She saw a single mother who had made a difficult decision under pressure, a nurse who had prioritized patient care over job security, and a woman who was still trying to figure out how to pay next month's rent. But apparently, others saw something more significant in her actions. They saw courage, dedication, and a commitment to service that transcended personal consequences. For the first time since her termination from Mercy General, Maria began to believe that her decision to save Captain Mitchell's life might lead to something better than the career she had lost. The news of Maria's impending White House visit spread through San Diego's medical community like wildfire. By Tuesday afternoon, her phone was ringing constantly with calls from local news stations, medical journals, and nursing organizations who had somehow obtained her contact information. The story had evolved from a simple hospital personnel matter into a national conversation about healthcare priorities, patient advocacy, and the courage required to challenge institutional authority when lives hang in the balance. Maria found herself thrust into a spotlight she had never sought and wasn't sure she wanted. Every conversation seemed to require her to defend or explain decisions she had made instinctively in a moment of crisis. Reporters wanted to know about her background, her motivations, and her feelings about being terminated for saving a life. The attention felt overwhelming and intrusive, particularly when photographers began appearing outside Tommy's school and their apartment complex. The irony wasn't lost on her that the same actions, which had cost her job, were now being celebrated on a national stage. Dr. Harrison's decision to terminate her employment had been intended to send a message about the importance of following hospital protocol regardless of circumstances. Instead, his action had inadvertently created a symbol of everything that was right about putting patient care above administrative concerns. Lisa Chun called Tuesday evening with updates from Mercy General that painted a picture of institutional chaos and divided loyalties. The nursing staff was openly questioning Dr. Harrison's leadership, and several physicians had submitted formal complaints about the hospital's handling of Maria's situation. The story had reached the attention of the hospital's board of directors, who were reportedly concerned about the negative publicity and its potential impact on the institution's reputation. Dr. Harrison is furious about the media attention, Lisa reported, her voice carrying barely concealed satisfaction at her former supervisor's discomfort. He's been locked in meetings all day with hospital executives and legal counsel. Word is that they're trying to figure out how to distance the hospital from the controversy without admitting they made a mistake. Maria felt a mixture of vindication and sadness at the news. She had never wanted to create problems for Mercy General or her former colleagues, but she also couldn't regret standing up for what she believed was right. The hospital's current difficulties were a direct result of prioritizing administrative control over patient advocacy, and perhaps the negative consequences would encourage them to reconsider their policies. What about Captain Mitchell? Maria asked, genuinely concerned about his recovery and worried that the media attention might be affecting his medical care. He's doing remarkably well, Lisa replied. The surgery was completely successful, and he's already asking about returning to active duty. Dr. Kim said his recovery has been textbook perfect, which is exactly what you'd expect from someone who received immediate surgical intervention instead of being transferred while his condition deteriorated. The confirmation of Captain Mitchell's excellent prognosis provided Maria with deep satisfaction that transcended all the professional and personal turmoil she was experiencing. Regardless of what happened next in her career or her relationship with Mercy General, she knew that her decision had achieved its most important objective. A human being was alive and healthy because she had chosen to act on her medical training rather than defer to administrative authority. Wednesday brought a new development that further complicated Maria's situation. A courier delivered an overnight package containing a formal letter from Mercy General's legal department. The document was filled with complex legal language, but its basic message was clear. The hospital was offering to reinstate her employment, restore her full benefits, and provide a financial settlement in exchange for her agreement not to discuss the circumstances of her termination with media outlets or in any public forum. Maria read the letter 3 times, trying to understand all the implications of what was being offered. The financial settlement was substantial enough to resolve many of her immediate concerns about supporting Tommy and maintaining their apartment. The reinstatement would restore her professional standing and eliminate the employment gap that was complicating her job search efforts. On the surface, accepting the offer seemed like the practical and sensible choice. But the restriction on public discussion felt like an attempt to silence her voice at exactly the moment when her experience was contributing to important conversations about healthcare priorities and patient advocacy. The hospital's offer suggested they were more concerned with managing their public image than addressing the underlying policy issues that had created the crisis in the first place. Maria called the one person whose judgment she trusted completely. In situations involving complex ethical decisions, Dr. Patricia Morales had been her mentor during nursing school and remained a close friend despite their busy schedules. As the director of nursing at a large hospital in Los Angeles, Dr. Morales understood both the practical realities of healthcare administration and the principles that should guide patient care decisions. "They're trying to buy your silence," Dr. Morales said bluntly after Maria read the letter over the phone. "The financial settlement and job reinstatement are secondary concerns. What they really want is your agreement to stop talking about what happened, because your story is making other healthcare workers question similar policies at their own institutions. But if I don't accept their offer, I'm still unemployed." "With a child to support," Maria replied, voicing the practical concerns that had been weighing on her mind. "The White House ceremony is an honor, but it doesn't pay Tommy's school expenses or our rent." Dr. Morales was quiet for a moment, and Maria could hear the sound of papers rustling as her mentor considered the situation. "Maria, what you did at Mercy General was exactly what we train nurses to do. You assessed a critical situation, prioritized patient needs, and acted with courage and competence to save a life. The fact that hospital administrators punished you for following your professional training says everything about their priorities and nothing about your judgment. So you think I should reject their offer? I think you should make whatever decision allows you to sleep at night and look at yourself in the mirror with pride," Dr. Morales replied. "But I also think you should consider the broader implications of your choice. There are thousands of nurses working in hospitals across the country who face similar pressure to prioritize administrative concerns over patient care. Your willingness to speak publicly about these issues might help protect future patients and support other healthcare workers who find themselves in comparable situations." The conversation with Dr. Morales clarified Maria's thinking about the hospital's offer, but it also highlighted the weight of responsibility she was carrying. Her individual decision about how to respond to Mercy General's legal settlement would send a message about the relative importance of institutional loyalty versus patient advocacy. Other healthcare workers would be watching to see whether she chose personal security or continued public discussion of systemic problems. That evening, Maria sat at her kitchen table with the legal documents spread in front of her while Tommy worked on homework assignments at the other end of the table. The contrast between her adult concerns about healthcare policy and her son's elementary school math problems provided a sense of perspective about what truly mattered in their daily lives. Whatever decision she made about Mercy General's offer, her primary responsibility remained ensuring Tommy's well-being and security. "Mom, are you famous now?" Tommy asked suddenly, looking up from his worksheet with the direct curiosity that only children could manage. "Why do you ask that?" Maria replied, wondering how much of the recent media attention had filtered down to his level of awareness. "Mrs. Peterson at school said she saw you on the news," Tommy explained. "She said you're a hero because you saved someone's life at work. Is that true?" Maria considered how to explain the situation in terms that an 8-year-old could understand without overwhelming him with adult complexities about institutional politics and career consequences. "I helped take care of someone who was very sick, and some people think that was special. But really, I just did what any nurse would do." "Are you going to be on TV again?" Tommy asked with the kind of excitement that children reserve for anything involving celebrities or unusual attention. "Maybe," Maria admitted. "I might have to travel to Washington, D.C. for a special ceremony. Would you be okay staying with Mrs. Chun for a few days if that happens?" Tommy nodded enthusiastically, apparently thrilled by the idea of his mother doing something important enough to require travel to the nation's capital. His acceptance of the situation reminded Maria that children often adapt to changing circumstances more easily than adults, particularly when they trust that the responsible adults in their lives are making good decisions. Thursday morning brought another unexpected phone call, this time from Captain Mitchell himself. Maria was surprised to hear his voice, partly because she hadn't expected him to contact her directly, and partly because he sounded remarkably strong for someone who had undergone emergency surgery less than a week earlier. "Ms. Rodriguez, I wanted to call personally to thank you for what you did," Captain Mitchell said, his voice carrying the formal courtesy that Maria associated with military training. "I understand that you sacrificed your job to ensure I received immediate medical care, and I want you to know that your actions won't be forgotten." "I'm just glad you're recovering well," Maria replied, feeling somewhat awkward about receiving gratitude for doing what she considered her professional duty. "How are you feeling?" "Better every day, thanks to your quick thinking and courage," Captain Mitchell responded. "Dr. Kim explained that my condition was deteriorating rapidly, and that the surgery couldn't have been delayed without serious consequences. You saved my life, and you did it knowing that you would face professional retaliation for challenging hospital protocol." The conversation continued for several minutes, with Captain Mitchell describing his recovery process and expressing gratitude that went far beyond what Maria felt she deserved. He mentioned that his family had been devastated by news of the accident and profoundly relieved by his successful surgery and rapid recovery. His wife and teenage children had wanted to contact Maria directly to express their appreciation, but they had respected her privacy during what they understood was a difficult period in her own life. "Captain Mitchell, can I ask you something?" Maria said as their conversation was winding down. "Of course. How did the White House learn about what happened?" "I'm still trying to understand how a local hospital situation attracted federal attention." Captain Mitchell chuckled softly. "Navy personnel take care of their own, Ms. Rodriguez. When word reached my commanding officers that I had nearly died because of hospital administrative delays, and that a civilian nurse had risked her career to ensure I received proper medical care, that information made its way up the chain of command very quickly. The Navy has significant influence in Washington, particularly when it comes to recognizing people who serve our military personnel with exceptional dedication." The explanation helped Maria understand how her situation had evolved from a local employment matter into a national recognition ceremony. Captain Mitchell wasn't just any Navy officer. He was apparently senior enough and well-connected, enough that his near-death experience and dramatic rescue had attracted attention at the highest levels of military and civilian leadership. After ending the call with Captain Mitchell, Maria found herself thinking about the chain of events that had led to her current situation. A split-second decision to prioritize patient care over administrative protocol had cost her job, but it had also set in motion a series of developments that were transforming her professional standing and public profile in ways she never could have anticipated. The irony was that Maria had never sought recognition or attention for her work as a nurse. She had chosen healthcare as a profession because she wanted to help people during their most vulnerable moments, not because she wanted to become a public figure or policy advocate. The spotlight she was now experiencing felt uncomfortable and unnatural, even though she understood that her story was resonating with people who shared her beliefs about the primacy of patient care. Friday afternoon brought the final piece of information. Maria needed to make her decision about Mercy General's settlement offer. Sarah Thompson called from the White House Personnel Office with details about the upcoming ceremony and the broader context of Maria's recognition. "Ms. Rodriguez, I wanted to let you know that your situation has attracted significant attention from healthcare policy advocates and patient rights organizations," Sarah Thompson explained. "The President's decision to present you with the Citizens Medal is being viewed as a statement about the administration's support for healthcare workers who prioritize patient care over institutional concerns. What does that mean for me personally?" Maria asked, still trying to understand the implications of becoming an inadvertent symbol for healthcare reform. "It means that your experience is contributing to national conversations about medical ethics, patient advocacy, and the pressures that healthcare workers face when institutional policies conflict with patient needs," Sarah Thompson replied. "Your willingness to speak publicly about these issues is helping to shine light on systemic problems that affect healthcare delivery across the country." The conversation with Sarah Thompson confirmed what Dr. Morales had suggested about the broader significance of Maria's situation. Her individual experience was being used to illustrate larger problems with healthcare administration and the need for policies that consistently prioritize patient well-being over institutional liability concerns. That evening, Maria made her decision about Mercy General's settlement offer. She drafted a brief letter declining their financial package and employment reinstatement, explaining that she couldn't accept restrictions on discussing her experience when that discussion might help protect future patients and support other healthcare workers facing similar ethical dilemmas. The decision felt both liberating and terrifying. By rejecting the hospital's offer, Maria was choosing uncertainty over security, principle over pragmatism. She still didn't have a job, she still faced financial pressures, and she still needed to find a way to support Tommy while rebuilding her career. But she also retained her voice and her ability to contribute to important conversations about healthcare priorities. As she sealed the letter and prepared to mail it the next morning, Maria reflected on how much her life had changed in just 1 week. She had gone from being an anonymous emergency room nurse to a nationally recognized symbol of patient advocacy. She had lost the job she loved, but gained a platform to discuss issues she cared deeply about. She had sacrificed financial security, but preserved her integrity and professional values. The path forward remained unclear and challenging, but for the first time since her termination from Mercy General, Maria felt confident that she had made decisions she could defend to Tommy, to herself, and to the healthcare workers who might benefit from her willingness to speak truth about the pressures they faced in their daily work. The morning flight from San Diego to Washington, D.C. felt like stepping into an alternate reality for Maria Rodriguez. She had never traveled first class before, and the comfortable leather seat and attentive flight service seemed almost absurdly luxurious compared to her usual experiences with air travel. Tommy sat beside her, his face pressed to the window as he watched the landscape change from the desert southwest to the green hills of the East Coast. The White House had arranged for both of them to attend the ceremony understanding that Maria's 8-year-old son was an integral part of her story and her motivation. The past week had brought a whirlwind of media interviews, phone calls from nursing organizations, and messages of support from healthcare workers across the country. Maria's decision to decline Mercy General's settlement offer had been reported in several major newspapers, and her story had become a rallying point for discussions about patient advocacy and healthcare reform. The attention remained overwhelming, but Maria was beginning to understand how her individual experience connected to larger issues that affected millions of patients and healthcare workers. Dr. Patricia Morales had flown in from Los Angeles to attend the ceremony, bringing with her a delegation of nursing school deans and healthcare policy advocates who wanted to show their support for Maria's principled stand. The group would be seated in a special section designated for healthcare professionals, and their presence represented the broader nursing community's endorsement of patient-centered care over administrative convenience. As their plane began its descent into Ronald Reagan Washington National Airport, Maria felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness that reminded her of her first day of nursing school. She was about to meet the President of the United States and receive recognition that she still didn't entirely believe she deserved. The ceremony would be covered by national media, and her words and actions would be scrutinized by people across the country who were following her story. Tommy had handled the entire experience with the adaptability and excitement that seemed natural to children his age. He had been thrilled to miss school for such an important occasion, and he had spent hours researching the White House and asking questions about what would happen during the ceremony. His enthusiasm helped counterbalance Maria's anxiety about being thrust into such a public role. The car that met them at the airport was another reminder of how dramatically their circumstances had changed. The driver was courteous and professional, and the vehicle was equipped with bottled water, snacks, and current newspapers featuring stories about the upcoming ceremony. Maria found herself mentioned in several articles about healthcare workers who had been recognized for exceptional service, though she remained uncomfortable with the level of attention her situation was receiving. Their hotel in downtown Washington was elegant and historic, the kind of establishment Maria had only seen in movies or television shows. The staff treated them with respectful deference, and Maria realized that the White House Personnel Office had clearly communicated the importance of their visit. Tommy was fascinated by everything from the marble lobby to the formal dining room, and his wonder helped Maria appreciate the significance of what was happening. That evening brought a reception for ceremony participants and their families, held in a beautiful ballroom overlooking the Potomac River. Maria found herself in conversation with other civilians who were being recognized for various forms of public service, and she was struck by the diversity of their backgrounds and accomplishments. There were teachers who had transformed struggling schools, community volunteers who had addressed homelessness, and business leaders who had created innovative programs for disadvantaged youth. The common thread among all the honorees was a willingness to prioritize service over personal convenience, to take risks for the benefit of others, and to persist in doing what they believed was right despite obstacles or opposition. Maria began to understand that her experience at Mercy General was part of a larger pattern of American civilians who chose to serve their communities with exceptional dedication and courage. Captain James Mitchell attended the reception with his wife and 2 teenage children, and Maria was moved by their gratitude and warmth when they finally met in person. Mrs. Mitchell embraced Maria with tears in her eyes, explaining that their family had been devastated by news of the accident, and eternally grateful for Maria's life-saving intervention. The captain's children, a 16-year-old daughter and 14-year-old son, thanked Maria with the earnest sincerity that teenagers reserve for truly meaningful moments. "Ms. Rodriguez, our dad means everything to us," the captain's daughter said, her voice steady despite the emotion in her eyes. "We almost lost him because some people cared more about rules than saving his life. Thank you for being brave enough to do what was right." The conversation with Captain Mitchell's family provided Maria with a deeply personal understanding of the consequences of her decision to challenge hospital protocol. These weren't abstract patients or theoretical medical scenarios. They were real people whose lives had been forever changed by her willingness to prioritize immediate medical intervention over administrative approval. The weight of that responsibility felt both humbling and empowering. Dr. Sandra Kim had also traveled to Washington for the ceremony, bringing with her a detailed medical report that documented Captain Mitchell's condition and the time-sensitive nature of his treatment needs. Her presence at the reception was particularly meaningful to Maria because Dr. Kim had risked her own professional standing by supporting Maria's decision to proceed with emergency surgery despite Dr. Harrison's objections. "Maria, what you did that night exemplified everything we try to teach medical students about patient advocacy," Dr. Kim said as they stood together watching Tommy interact with the other children at the reception. "You assessed a critical situation, made a medically sound decision, and acted with courage to save a life. The fact that hospital administrators punished you for following your professional training is an indictment of their priorities, not your judgment." The validation from Dr. Kim meant more to Maria than any media coverage or public recognition because it came from a physician who understood exactly what had happened that night and why immediate surgical intervention had been medically necessary. Her support helped confirm that Maria's decision had been based on sound clinical judgment rather than emotional impulse or insubordination. The morning of the ceremony dawned clear and bright, with the kind of crisp autumn weather that made Washington, D.C. look like a postcard. Maria dressed carefully in the navy blue suit she had purchased specifically for the occasion, wanting to look professional and appropriate for such a formal event. Tommy wore his best clothes, a button-down shirt and dress pants that made him look older and more serious than his usual 8-year-old demeanor. The White House was even more impressive in person than Maria had expected from photographs and television coverage. The security procedures were thorough but respectful, and the staff members who guided them through the building were knowledgeable and gracious. Tommy's eyes were wide with amazement as they walked through rooms he had only seen in history books, and his excitement helped Maria appreciate the historical significance of the moment. The Rose Garden had been arranged with rows of chairs, facing a podium where the president would speak and present the awards. The autumn flowers were still blooming, and the setting provided a beautiful backdrop for the ceremony. Maria's section was near the front, with clear sight lines to the podium and space for the media photographers who would document the event. As the ceremony began, Maria found herself thinking about the journey that had brought her to this moment. Less than 2 weeks ago, she had been an anonymous emergency room nurse struggling to make ends meet as a single mother. Today, she was sitting in the White House Rose Garden about to receive recognition from the President of the United States for actions that had cost her job but saved a life. The President's remarks were thoughtful and personal, acknowledging each honoree's specific contributions and connecting their individual stories to broader themes about American values and civic responsibility. When he reached Maria's story, his words captured both the personal courage she had demonstrated and the larger questions her experience raised about healthcare priorities. Maria Rodriguez faced a choice that no healthcare worker should have to make, the president said, his voice carrying across the garden with clear authority. She could follow institutional protocol and risk watching a patient die, or she could trust her medical training and professional judgment to save a life, knowing that she would face severe professional consequences. She chose to save the life. And in doing so, she reminded all of us that the highest calling of healthcare is always to serve patients, not bureaucracy. When Maria's name was called, she walked to the podium with steady steps despite the butterflies in her stomach. The Presidential Citizens Medal was heavier than she had expected, and the president's handshake was firm and warm as he congratulated her on her courage and dedication. The applause from the audience was sustained and heartfelt, and Maria could see Tommy beaming with pride from his seat in the front row. The brief conversation she had with the president while cameras captured the moment was surprisingly personal and substantive. He asked about her plans for the future and expressed genuine interest in her perspective on healthcare policy and patient advocacy. His question suggested that he had been thoroughly briefed on her situation and understood the complexities of the issues her experience had highlighted. Ms. Rodriguez, your willingness to speak publicly about the pressures healthcare workers face when institutional policies conflict with patient needs is helping to drive important conversations about medical ethics and healthcare reform, the president said. I hope you'll continue to use your voice to advocate for policies that consistently prioritize patient care. The suggestion that her role as a public advocate might continue beyond the ceremony was both exciting and daunting. Maria had never imagined herself as a policy spokesperson or healthcare reform activist, but she was beginning to understand that her experience had given her a platform to address issues that affected countless patients and medical professionals. After the ceremony, the reception provided an opportunity for Maria to meet other healthcare policy advocates and nursing leaders who had been following her story. Dr. Elizabeth Warren, a prominent healthcare researcher, approached her with information about speaking opportunities at medical conferences and policy forums. Several nursing schools extended invitations for Maria to address their students about patient advocacy and professional ethics. The most significant conversation came with Dr. Michael Roberts, the Chief of Staff at Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore. He had traveled to Washington specifically to meet Maria and discuss potential employment opportunities that would allow her to combine clinical nursing with healthcare policy advocacy and education. Ms. Rodriguez, we've been following your situation closely, and we're impressed not only by your clinical judgment under pressure, but also by your willingness to speak publicly about systemic problems in healthcare administration, Dr. Roberts explained. We have a position opening for a clinical nurse specialist in our emergency department, with additional responsibilities for policy development and staff education about patient advocacy. The role would allow you to continue working with patients, while also contributing to larger conversations about healthcare priorities. The job offer from Johns Hopkins represented more than just employment. It was an opportunity to rebuild her career in a way that honored both her clinical skills and her newfound role as an advocate for patient-centered care. The position would provide financial security for her and Tommy while allowing her to continue speaking about the issues her experience had brought to national attention. Tommy spent the afternoon exploring the White House with other children attending the ceremony, guided by staff members who clearly enjoyed sharing the building's history with young visitors. His excitement about the experience was infectious, and Maria realized that this day would become one of his foundational childhood memories. The story he would tell for the rest of his life would be about the day his mother was honored by the president for having the courage to do what was right. The flight back to San Diego that evening provided time for Maria to reflect on how completely her life had changed in just 2 weeks. She had lost a job but gained a national platform. She had faced professional criticism but received presidential recognition. She had sacrificed financial security but preserved her integrity and professional values. Most importantly, she had demonstrated to Tommy that sometimes the most important decisions require courage and a willingness to accept difficult consequences for doing what you believe is right. The media coverage of the ceremony was extensive and largely positive, with editorial writers and healthcare policy experts using Maria's story to discuss broader questions about medical ethics, patient advocacy, and healthcare reform. Several nursing organizations announced plans to use her experience as a case study in professional ethics courses, and multiple medical journals published articles analyzing the institutional pressures that healthcare workers face when administrative policies conflict with patient needs. Within a week of returning from Washington, Maria had received job offers from 3 major hospital systems, speaking invitations from dozens of nursing schools and medical conferences, and book deal proposals from several publishers interested in her story. The attention remained overwhelming, but it was becoming clear that her experience had resonated with people across the healthcare industry, who shared her commitment to patient-centered care. The decision to accept the position at Johns Hopkins felt right for both professional and personal reasons. The hospital's reputation for clinical excellence and patient advocacy aligned with Maria's values, and the location in Baltimore would provide Tommy with access to excellent schools and cultural opportunities. Most importantly, the role would allow her to continue working as a nurse while also contributing to larger conversations about healthcare policy and medical ethics. Dr. Harrison's reaction to Maria's national recognition and prestigious job offer was reportedly one of frustrated anger, according to Lisa Chun, who remained at Mercy General despite the ongoing controversy surrounding Maria's termination. The hospital's board of directors had quietly reversed Dr. Harrison's decision and attempted to contact Maria about returning to her previous position, but their offer came too late and with too many conditions to be attractive. The contrast between Mercy General's eventual recognition of their mistake and the immediate support Maria had received from Johns Hopkins illustrated the difference between institutions that prioritized administrative control and those that valued patient advocacy and professional courage. Maria's experience had become a case study in how healthcare organizations respond to ethical challenges and the consequences of those responses for their reputations and ability to attract talented staff. 3 months after the White House ceremony, Maria stood in the emergency department at Johns Hopkins, wearing scrubs that bore the logo of one of America's most prestigious medical institutions. She was back to doing what she loved most, caring for patients during their most vulnerable moments and teaching other healthcare workers about the importance of advocacy and courage in medical decision-making. The recognition she had received for saving Captain Mitchell's life had opened doors she never could have imagined. But the core motivation remained the same, ensuring that patients received the best possible care, regardless of administrative obstacles or institutional politics. Her story had become a symbol of what was possible when healthcare workers chose principle over convenience, patience over protocol, and courage over conformity. Tommy adapted to their new life in Baltimore with the resilience that had carried him through all their previous transitions. His new school was challenging and supportive, and he had made friends who were impressed that his mother had met the president and been on television. Most importantly, he had learned from watching Maria's experience that doing the right thing sometimes requires sacrifice but ultimately leads to outcomes that honor your values and benefit others. The Presidential Citizens Medal sat on Maria's dresser at home, a daily reminder of the night when she had chosen to trust her professional judgment over institutional authority. But the real reward was the knowledge that Captain Mitchell was alive and healthy, that her story had contributed to important conversations about healthcare priorities, and that she had demonstrated to Tommy and to healthcare workers across the country that courage and principle could triumph over bureaucracy and intimidation. Maria's journey from anonymous emergency room nurse to national healthcare advocate had been unexpected and often overwhelming, but it had also been profoundly meaningful. She had learned that individual actions, taken with courage and guided by professional values, could have consequences far beyond their immediate circumstances. Her willingness to risk her career to save a life had not only preserved Captain Mitchell's future, but had also contributed to a larger conversation about the values that should guide American healthcare. The story of that night at Mercy General would continue to be told in nursing schools, medical conferences, and policy forums as an example of what healthcare could be when professionals prioritized patient welfare over administrative convenience. Maria Rodriguez had become more than a nurse who saved a life. She had become a symbol of the courage and integrity that the healthcare profession needed to reclaim its highest ideals. The autumn sun filtered through the tall windows of Johns Hopkins Hospital's emergency department as Maria Rodriguez completed her 3rd month in what had become the most fulfilling position of her nursing career. The bustling trauma center bore similarities to Mercy General, but the institutional culture was fundamentally different. Here, patient advocacy wasn't just tolerated. It was actively encouraged and supported by administration at every level. The contrast with her previous workplace had been immediately apparent and deeply reassuring. Dr. Michael Roberts had proven to be exactly the kind of leader Maria had hoped to work with when she accepted the position. During their weekly meetings, he consistently emphasized that clinical judgment and patient welfare should guide all medical decisions, and he had made it clear that staff members would be supported when they advocated for appropriate patient care, even when that advocacy challenged standard procedures or administrative preferences. The role of clinical nurse specialist had allowed Maria to blend direct patient care with education and policy development in ways that felt both professionally satisfying and personally meaningful. She spent her shifts working alongside emergency department nurses, sharing the knowledge and experience she had gained from years of critical care nursing. But she also developed training programs, reviewed hospital policies, and served as a patient advocate when complex ethical situations arose. Tommy had thrived in their new environment, adapting to his Baltimore elementary school with enthusiasm and making friends who were fascinated by his mother's story and their recent White House visit. The stability of Maria's new position had allowed them to settle into a comfortable routine, and Tommy's nightmares had disappeared completely once their living situation became secure and predictable again. The speaking engagements that had emerged from Maria's national recognition were beginning to take shape into a secondary career that complemented her clinical work. She had addressed nursing conferences in Chicago, Atlanta, and Seattle, sharing her experience and discussing the importance of patient advocacy in healthcare settings. The audiences were consistently engaged and supportive, and Maria was developing confidence as a public speaker on healthcare policy issues. The most impactful speaking opportunity had come from the American Nurses Association's annual conference, where Maria delivered a keynote address to over 3,000 nursing professionals. Her talk, titled "When Protocol Meets Purpose: Navigating Ethical Challenges in Patient Care," had received standing ovations and generated extensive discussion about the pressures nurses face when institutional policies conflict with patient needs. During that presentation, Maria had shared not only her experience with Captain Mitchell, but also broader observations about the healthcare system's tendency to prioritize administrative convenience over patient welfare. She had challenged her audience to consider their own ethical obligations and to develop the courage necessary to advocate for patients, even when that advocacy created professional risks. The response from the nursing community had been overwhelmingly positive, with many attendees sharing their own stories of ethical challenges and institutional pressure. Maria realized that her experience at Mercy General was far from unique. Healthcare workers across the country regularly faced similar situations where they had to choose between following protocols and advocating for optimal patient care. Captain Mitchell had remained in contact with Maria, sending periodic updates about his recovery and return to active duty. His complete restoration to health had been remarkable, and his commanding officers had attributed his successful outcome to the immediate surgical intervention he had received. The Navy had conducted its own review of the incident, concluding that Maria's actions had been medically appropriate and professionally courageous. More significantly, Captain Mitchell had become an advocate for healthcare workers who prioritized patient care over administrative concerns. He had spoken at several military medical conferences about the importance of supporting civilian healthcare providers who served military personnel with exceptional dedication. His influence within Navy medical circles had contributed to policy Discussions about how military healthcare systems could better support patient advocacy among civilian providers. The relationship between Maria and Captain Mitchell's family had evolved into a genuine friendship based on mutual respect and shared values. Mrs. Mitchell had become involved in healthcare advocacy organizations, and their teenage children had written school reports about the importance of courage in professional settings. The entire family had attended Maria's keynote presentation at the nursing conference, providing visible support for her message about patient advocacy. Dr. Patricia Morales had visited Baltimore several times since Maria's move, partly to see how her former student was adapting to her new role and partly to collaborate on research projects about nursing ethics and patient advocacy. Their conversations had evolved into plans for a joint research study, examining how hospital policies and administrative pressures affected nursing decision-making in emergency situations. The research project had attracted funding from several nursing organizations and healthcare foundations interested in understanding the systemic factors that influenced patient care quality. Maria's experience provided a compelling case study, but the broader research would examine hundreds of similar situations to identify patterns and develop recommendations for policy changes that could better support patient advocacy. Lisa Chun had eventually left Mercy General, accepting a position at a community hospital where the administration was more supportive of nursing autonomy and patient advocacy. Her departure had been part of a broader exodus of experienced nurses who had become disillusioned with Dr. Harrison's leadership and the institutional culture he had created. The hospital was struggling to maintain adequate staffing levels, and their reputation in San Diego's medical community had suffered significantly. The contrast between Mercy General's ongoing difficulties and Maria's professional success at Johns Hopkins had not gone unnoticed in healthcare circles. Several medical journals had published articles analyzing how institutional responses to ethical challenges affected both patient outcomes and staff retention. Maria's situation had become a case study in how organizations could either support or undermine healthcare workers who advocated for appropriate patient care. Dr. Harrison had eventually resigned from his position at Mercy General, though the circumstances of his departure had not been made public. According to Lisa Chun, his leadership had become increasingly isolated as medical staff and nursing personnel lost confidence in his judgment and priorities. The hospital's board of directors had apparently concluded that his approach to administration was counterproductive and damaging to the institution's reputation. The news of Dr. Harrison's resignation had provided Maria with a sense of vindication, though she took no pleasure in his professional difficulties. She had never sought to damage his career or create problems for Mercy General. She had simply wanted to ensure that patients received appropriate medical care, regardless of administrative obstacles. The fact that her principled stand had ultimately been vindicated by institutional changes felt gratifying but also sobering. The book project that had emerged from publisher interest in Maria's story was taking shape as a broader examination of healthcare ethics and patient advocacy rather than simply a personal memoir. Working with a professional writer, Maria was developing a narrative that used her experience as a framework for discussing larger questions about medical ethics, institutional pressures, and the courage required to prioritize patient welfare over administrative convenience. The book would include interviews with other healthcare workers who had faced similar ethical dilemmas, analysis of policy issues that created conflicts between patient care and institutional priorities, and practical guidance for medical professionals navigating complex ethical situations. The goal was to create a resource that would help healthcare workers develop the knowledge and courage necessary to advocate effectively for their patients. Tommy had begun showing interest in healthcare careers, partly inspired by watching his mother's work and partly fascinated by the scientific aspects of medicine that he observed during visits to Johns Hopkins. Maria was careful not to pressure him toward any particular profession. but she was pleased that he was developing an appreciation for service-oriented careers and an understanding of the importance of helping others. The Presidential Citizens Medal continued to occupy a place of honor in their Baltimore home, but its significance had evolved from a symbol of recognition to a reminder of responsibility. Maria understood that her platform as a nationally recognized healthcare advocate came with obligations to continue speaking about patient advocacy and healthcare reform, even when those discussions were challenging or controversial. The policy work that had become part of Maria's role at Johns Hopkins was expanding beyond the hospital to include collaboration with state and federal healthcare agencies. She had been invited to participate in advisory committees examining nursing workforce issues and patient safety regulations. Her perspective as both a practicing nurse and a public advocate for patient-centered care was valued by policymakers seeking to understand how institutional pressures affected healthcare delivery. One particularly meaningful project involved working with the Department of Veterans Affairs to develop training programs for civilian healthcare workers who treated military personnel. Maria's experience with Captain Mitchell had highlighted the importance of understanding military culture and the specific healthcare needs of service members and veterans. The training programs she helped develop were being implemented in hospitals across the country that served significant numbers of military patients. The financial security that came with her position at Johns Hopkins had allowed Maria to establish a college savings account for Tommy and begin paying down her nursing school loans more aggressively. The contrast with her previous financial stress was remarkable, and she was grateful for the stability that allowed her to focus on her work and Tommy's needs without constant worry about basic expenses. The speaking fees from her conference presentations provided additional income that Maria was using to support nursing students who faced financial challenges similar to those she had experienced. She had established a small scholarship fund that provided assistance to single mothers pursuing nursing degrees, understanding firsthand how difficult it could be to balance educational goals with family responsibilities and financial pressures. The media attention surrounding Maria's story had gradually diminished to a manageable level, though she continued to receive interview requests from healthcare publications and policy organizations. She had learned to be selective about media opportunities, focusing on those that allowed her to discuss substantive policy issues rather than simply retelling her personal story. The goal was to use her platform to advance conversations about healthcare reform rather than simply maintaining her public profile. Dr. Sandra Kim had also left Mercy General, accepting a position as Emergency Department Director at a prestigious academic medical center in Phoenix. Her departure had been influenced partly by her frustration with the institutional response to Maria's situation and partly by career opportunities that better aligned with her commitment to patient advocacy and medical education. Her new position allowed her to implement policies that supported healthcare workers who prioritized patient welfare over administrative convenience. The friendship that had developed between Maria and Dr. Kim had been strengthened by their shared experience at Mercy General and their common commitment to patient-centered care. They collaborated on research projects and conference presentations about emergency medicine ethics, and Dr. Kim had become one of Maria's strongest professional references and advocates within the medical community. The nursing students who attended Maria's guest lectures at Johns Hopkins and other institutions were consistently engaged and inspired by her message about the importance of courage and advocacy in healthcare settings. Many of them faced similar pressures in their clinical rotations, and Maria's example provided them with both practical guidance and emotional support for navigating ethical challenges in their future careers. The impact of Maria's story on nursing education had been broader than she had initially anticipated. Several nursing schools had revised their ethics curricula to include more emphasis on patient advocacy and the importance of challenging inappropriate institutional policies. Her experience had become a standard case study in courses on professional ethics and healthcare policy, helping to prepare future nurses for the complex decisions they would face in clinical practice. The research collaboration with Dr. Morales had produced preliminary findings that confirmed Maria's observation that healthcare workers frequently faced pressure to prioritize administrative concerns over patient care. The data showed that nurses who worked in institutions with strong patient advocacy policies were more likely to report job satisfaction and less likely to experience moral distress when ethical conflicts arose. The implications of this research extended beyond individual job satisfaction to include patient safety and healthcare quality issues. Healthcare workers who felt supported in their advocacy efforts were more likely to speak up about potential problems and more willing to challenge practices that might compromise patient welfare. The research was contributing to policy discussions about how healthcare organizations could create cultures that encouraged and supported patient advocacy. Captain Mitchell had been promoted to admiral, a recognition that his superiors attributed partly to his exceptional leadership and partly to the positive attention his recovery story had brought to Navy medical services. His continued advocacy for civilian healthcare workers who served military personnel had influenced Navy policy. Discussions about how to better support and recognize healthcare providers who demonstrated exceptional commitment to military patients. The relationship between Maria's family and Admiral Mitchell's family had evolved into a lasting friendship that transcended their initial connection through the medical emergency. Their children had become friends, and the families had begun spending holidays together. The bonds formed through shared experiences of crisis and recovery had created relationships that enriched both families' lives in unexpected ways. The policy work that occupied an increasing portion of Maria's professional time had led to invitations to testify before congressional committees, examining healthcare workforce issues and patient safety regulations. Her perspective as both a practicing healthcare worker and a patient advocate was valued by legislators seeking to understand how federal policies affected healthcare delivery at the local level. The congressional testimony had been both challenging and rewarding, requiring Maria to translate her clinical experience into policy recommendations that could guide legislative action. She had advocated for regulations that protected healthcare workers who reported patient safety concerns and policies that encouraged institutions to prioritize patient welfare over liability management. The experience had deepened her understanding of how healthcare policy was developed and implemented. The book project was nearing completion, with publication scheduled for the following spring. The narrative had evolved into a comprehensive examination of healthcare ethics that used Maria's story as a framework for discussing broader issues affecting patients and healthcare workers. Early reviews from medical ethicists and healthcare policy experts had been enthusiastic, suggesting that the book would make significant contributions to professional discussions about patient advocacy and institutional reform. Tommy had begun expressing interest in attending Johns Hopkins University when he was old enough for college, inspired partly by the campus environment he had observed during visits to Maria's workplace and partly by his growing fascination with scientific research. Maria was pleased that he was developing academic aspirations while also understanding that his interests might change as he matured. The speaking engagements that had emerged from Maria's recognition were evolving into a regular part of her professional activities, with requests coming from medical schools, nursing organizations, and healthcare policy groups across the country. She had developed expertise in translating complex ethical concepts into practical guidance that healthcare workers could apply in their daily practice. The financial stability and professional satisfaction that had resulted from Maria's move to Johns Hopkins had provided her with the security and confidence necessary to take on increasingly ambitious projects. She was planning to pursue a doctoral degree in nursing ethics with research focused on how institutional cultures affected healthcare workers' willingness and ability to advocate for patients. The doctoral program would allow Maria to combine her clinical experience with advanced research training, preparing her for academic positions that could influence nursing education and healthcare policy development. The goal was to create systematic approaches to supporting patient advocacy that could be implemented across healthcare institutions. The legacy of that night at Mercy General had expanded far beyond Maria's individual career to influence healthcare policy discussions, nursing education practices, and institutional approaches to patient advocacy. Her willingness to risk her job to save Captain Mitchell's life had demonstrated that individual courage could create systemic change when supported by professional communities and institutional leaders who shared similar values. The Presidential Citizens Medal had been the beginning rather than the culmination of Maria's impact on healthcare policy and patient advocacy. Her story continued to inspire healthcare workers facing similar ethical challenges, and her ongoing work in education, research, and policy development was contributing to systemic changes that would benefit countless future patients. Maria Rodriguez had transformed from an anonymous emergency room nurse into a nationally recognized advocate for patient-centered healthcare, but her core motivation remained unchanged, ensuring that every patient received the best possible care regardless of administrative obstacles or institutional politics. Her journey demonstrated that individual actions, guided by professional values and personal courage, could create ripple effects that transformed entire systems and inspired others to similar acts of principle and service. 5 years had passed since that transformative night at Mercy General Hospital, and Maria Rodriguez stood at the podium of the Grand Auditorium at Harvard Medical School, preparing to deliver the commencement address to graduating nursing students. The invitation to speak at such a prestigious institution represented the culmination of a journey that had taken her from unemployment and uncertainty to national recognition as one of America's leading voices on healthcare ethics and patient advocacy. The audience before her consisted of over 400 nursing graduates, their families, faculty members, and distinguished guests from across the medical community. Among the attendees sat Tommy, now 13 years old and beaming with pride as he watched his mother prepare to address one of the most accomplished groups of future healthcare professionals in the country. His presence in the front row provided Maria with the same sense of grounding and purpose that had sustained her through all the challenges and opportunities of the past 5 years. Dr. Patricia Morales sat in the distinguished faculty section, having recently been appointed as Dean of Nursing at Harvard after a distinguished career in research and education. Her mentorship and friendship had been instrumental in Maria's professional development, and her presence at this moment felt like a completion of a circle that had begun years earlier when Maria was struggling through nursing school as a single mother with limited resources and unlimited determination. The research collaboration between Maria and Dr. Morales had produced groundbreaking studies on healthcare ethics and institutional culture that had influenced policy discussions at federal and state levels. Their work had demonstrated conclusively that healthcare organizations with strong patient advocacy cultures produced better patient outcomes, higher staff satisfaction, and lower turnover rates among medical professionals. The findings had been published in major medical journals and had been cited in numerous policy documents and legislative hearings. Admiral James Mitchell, now serving as Chief of Naval Medical Operations, had attended the commencement ceremony, specifically to hear Maria speak. His presence represented not only personal gratitude for the life-saving care he had received, but also institutional recognition of the importance of civilian healthcare workers who served military personnel with exceptional dedication. His attendance had been covered by military and civilian media outlets as an example of the enduring bonds formed between service members and the healthcare professionals who cared for them. The book that Maria had co-authored with a professional Medical writer had become a standard text in nursing ethics courses across the country and had been translated into multiple languages for international distribution. Standing for Life, Patient Advocacy in Modern Healthcare, had won several awards from nursing and medical organizations and had been credited with inspiring a new generation of healthcare workers to prioritize patient welfare over institutional convenience. The Johns Hopkins position that had provided Maria with professional stability and intellectual stimulation had evolved into increasingly significant responsibilities as her expertise in healthcare ethics and policy development became nationally recognized. She now served as Director of Patient Advocacy and Ethics, overseeing programs that trained healthcare workers across the hospital system in ethical decision-making and patient-centered care approaches. Tommy's academic interests had continued to develop in directions that suggested potential future involvement in healthcare or scientific research. His exposure to his mother's work and the medical environment at Johns Hopkins had fostered curiosity about biology, chemistry, and the scientific principles underlying medical treatment. Maria was careful to support his interests without creating pressure, but she was pleased that he was developing an appreciation for careers focused on helping others. The doctoral degree in nursing ethics that Maria had completed 2 years earlier had opened opportunities for teaching and research that complemented her clinical and policy work. She now held adjunct faculty positions at several nursing schools, where she taught courses on professional ethics and healthcare policy to graduate students who would become the next generation of nursing leaders. The congressional testimony that had begun as occasional invitations had evolved into regular involvement in federal policy development related to healthcare workforce issues and patient safety regulations. Maria's unique perspective as both a practicing healthcare worker and a national advocate for patient-centered care made her testimony particularly valuable to legislators seeking to understand the practical implications of proposed policies. The speaking engagements that had emerged from Maria's national recognition had become a significant component of her professional activities, with requests coming from medical conferences, university commencements, and policy forums around the world. Her message about the importance of courage and principle in healthcare settings resonated with audiences across cultural and professional boundaries. The scholarship fund that Maria had established for nursing students facing financial challenges had grown through donations from healthcare organizations and individuals inspired by her story. The fund now provided assistance to dozens of students annually, with particular focus on supporting single mothers and first-generation college students pursuing nursing degrees. Many of the scholarship recipients had gone on to distinguished careers in healthcare, creating a multiplying effect of Maria's impact on the profession. Dr. Sandra Kim had become a close collaborator in research and policy work, using her position as Emergency Department Director to implement innovative approaches to patient advocacy and healthcare ethics. Their joint presentations at medical conferences had been influential in encouraging other healthcare institutions to examine their own policies and cultures related to patient advocacy and ethical decision-making. The friendship between the Rodriguez and Mitchell families had deepened over the years, with regular visits and shared vacations that had created bonds extending far beyond their initial connection through medical crisis. Admiral Mitchell's children had become like extended family to Tommy, and Mrs. Mitchell had become one of Maria's closest friends and most trusted advisors on both personal and professional matters. The policy work that occupied an increasing portion of Maria's time had contributed to significant changes in how healthcare institutions approached patient advocacy and ethical challenges. Several states had adopted regulations based on research findings from Maria's studies, and federal agencies had implemented guidelines that protected healthcare workers who reported patient safety concerns or challenged inappropriate institutional policies. The impact of Maria's story on nursing education had been transformative. with her experience becoming a standard case study in professional ethics courses and her principles of patient advocacy being integrated into curricula at nursing schools. Throughout the country, future generations of nurses were learning about the importance of courage and principle in healthcare settings, partly through engagement with Maria's example and ongoing work. The media attention that had initially felt overwhelming had evolved into strategic engagement with journalists and media outlets focused on healthcare policy and professional ethics issues. Maria had learned to use media opportunities to advance substantive discussions about healthcare reform rather than simply maintaining her public profile, and her interviews were consistently focused on policy implications rather than personal narrative. The financial security that had resulted from her position at Johns Hopkins and her speaking engagements had allowed Maria to make choices based on professional satisfaction and social impact rather than economic necessity. She had been able to turn down opportunities that didn't align with her values while pursuing projects that could make meaningful contributions to healthcare policy and patient advocacy. The research facilities at Johns Hopkins had provided Maria with resources to conduct increasingly sophisticated studies on healthcare ethics and institutional culture. Her current research project involved a multi-year longitudinal study examining how different approaches to patient advocacy training affected healthcare outcomes and professional satisfaction among nursing staff. The international recognition that had emerged from her work had led to invitations to speak at medical conferences and policy forums in Europe, Asia, and Latin America. The universal nature of ethical challenges in healthcare meant that her message about patient advocacy and professional courage resonated with audiences regardless of their specific healthcare systems or cultural contexts. The relationship with nursing students that had developed through her teaching responsibilities had been among the most rewarding aspects of Maria's expanded professional role. Working with future nurses provided opportunities to influence the next generation of healthcare professionals and to ensure that principles of patient advocacy and ethical practice would continue to guide the profession. The policy advisory positions that had emerged from Maria's expertise included membership on committees examining healthcare workforce development, patient safety regulations, and medical ethics standards. Her participation in these high-level policy discussions allowed her to influence systemic changes that could benefit millions of patients and healthcare workers. The academic medical center environment at Johns Hopkins had provided Maria with access to cutting-edge research and clinical practices while maintaining her connection to direct patient care. The combination of clinical work, research, teaching, and policy development had created a professional life that was both intellectually stimulating and personally meaningful. The mentorship relationships that Maria had developed with younger nurses and nursing students had created networks of healthcare professionals committed to patient advocacy and ethical practice. Many of her former students and mentees had gone on to leadership positions in healthcare organizations where they were implementing the principles and practices they had learned from her example and teaching. As Maria began her commencement address to the Harvard nursing graduates, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The decision to risk her career to save Admiral Mitchell's life had been made instinctively based on her professional training and personal values. She could never have anticipated that single moment of courage would transform her life and contribute to systemic changes in healthcare policy and professional education. Today you enter a profession that will test your knowledge, challenge your skills, and demand your courage, Maria told the assembled graduates. You will face moments when institutional pressures conflict with patient needs, when administrative convenience seems more important than clinical judgment, and when speaking up for what's right carries professional risks. In those moments, remember that the highest calling of healthcare is always to serve patients, not bureaucracy. The graduates listened with the intensity that comes from knowing they were hearing from someone whose words carried the weight of lived experience and demonstrated courage. Many of them had studied Maria's case during their ethics courses, and her presence before them represented the possibility that individual actions could create meaningful change in healthcare systems that sometimes seemed resistant to reform. Your profession needs leaders who will prioritize patient welfare over institutional convenience, who will speak truth to power when necessary, and who will never forget that behind every policy decision and administrative directive are real people whose lives depend on your courage and competence, Maria continued. You have the knowledge and skills to provide excellent care. I challenge you to also develop the courage to advocate for that care, even when advocacy requires personal sacrifice. The standing ovation that followed Maria's address lasted several minutes, with graduates, families, and faculty members expressing appreciation not only for her words, but for the example she had set throughout her career. The message that individual courage could create systemic change had particular resonance for new graduates who were preparing to enter healthcare systems that would test their values and professional commitments. Tommy watched the ovation with obvious pride, understanding that his mother had become someone whose words and actions influenced thousands of healthcare professionals across the country. The journey from that night at Mercy General to this moment at Harvard represented not only personal and professional success, but also the power of principle-guided action to create positive change in complex systems. The reception following the commencement ceremony provided opportunities for Maria to meet with graduates, faculty members, and distinguished guests who were interested in discussing healthcare policy and professional ethics issues. The conversations reinforced her understanding that the challenges she had faced at Mercy General were universal experiences for healthcare workers who sought to prioritize patient welfare over institutional convenience. Dr. Morales approached Maria during the reception with news that would mark another significant milestone in her career. Harvard Medical School was creating a new endowed chair in healthcare ethics and patient advocacy, and the search committee was hoping Maria would consider accepting the position. The role would provide opportunities to influence healthcare policy and professional education at the highest levels while maintaining clinical involvement and research activities. The offer from Harvard represented recognition of Maria's contributions to healthcare ethics and policy development, but it also represented new responsibilities and opportunities to expand her impact on the profession. The decision would require careful consideration of how the position would affect her relationship with Johns Hopkins, her ongoing research projects, and her family life with Tommy. Admiral Mitchell joined Maria and Dr. Morales during their conversation about the Harvard opportunity, offering perspective based on his experience with leadership transitions in military organizations. His advice emphasized the importance of considering how different opportunities aligned with long-term goals and personal values rather than simply focusing on prestige or financial considerations. The evening concluded with a private dinner attended by Maria's closest friends and collaborators, including Dr. Morales, Dr. Kim, Admiral Mitchell and his family, and Tommy. The gathering provided an opportunity to reflect on the journey that had brought them together and to consider the opportunities and challenges that lay ahead in their continued efforts to improve healthcare policy and patient advocacy. As they sat around the dinner table sharing stories and discussing future projects, Maria was struck by how a single moment of crisis had created lasting relationships and ongoing collaborations that continued to influence healthcare systems across the country. The decision to save Admiral Mitchell's life had been made in isolation, but its consequences had created communities of healthcare professionals committed to similar principles of patient advocacy and professional courage. The conversation at dinner touched on current challenges in healthcare policy, including workforce shortages, technological changes, and evolving patient expectations. The group discussed how the principles of patient advocacy and ethical practice that had guided Maria's career could be applied to these emerging challenges, and how their ongoing work could contribute to solutions. Tommy participated in the dinner conversation with the sophistication that came from years of exposure to healthcare policy discussions and professional ethics debates. His questions and observations demonstrated understanding of complex issues and suggested that his own future contributions to healthcare or related fields might build on the foundation his mother had established. The drive back to Baltimore the following morning provided Maria with time to reflect on the Harvard opportunity and its implications for her career and family life. The position would represent another significant milestone in a journey that had been marked by unexpected opportunities and challenging decisions. The key consideration would be determining how the role could maximize her impact on healthcare policy and patient advocacy, while maintaining the relationships and commitments that had sustained her throughout her career. The legacy of that night at Mercy General continued to influence healthcare policy discussions, professional education practices, and institutional approaches to patient advocacy. Maria's willingness to risk her career for patient welfare had demonstrated that individual courage could create systemic change when supported by professional communities and institutional leaders who shared similar values. The Presidential Citizens Medal remained in a place of honor in their Baltimore home, but its significance had evolved from recognition of past actions to inspiration for future service. Maria understood that her platform as a nationally recognized healthcare advocate came with ongoing responsibilities to continue advancing conversations about patient-centered care and professional ethics. The book that had emerged from her experience continued to influence nursing education and healthcare policy discussions, with new additions including updated research findings and contemporary case studies. The work had established Maria as a leading voice in healthcare ethics and had provided a foundation for continued research and advocacy activities. The scholarship fund that had grown from her initial commitment to supporting nursing students facing financial challenges had become a significant program that was influencing the profession by increasing diversity and supporting students who might not otherwise have access to nursing education. The recipients of these scholarships were beginning their own careers with appreciation for the importance of patient advocacy and community service. As Maria considered the Harvard opportunity and other future possibilities, she remained guided by the same principles that had motivated her decision to save Admiral Mitchell's life: commitment to patient welfare, professional integrity, and the courage to act on deeply held values regardless of personal consequences. These principles had transformed her life and had contributed to meaningful changes in healthcare systems across the country. The journey from anonymous emergency room nurse to nationally recognized healthcare advocate had been unexpected and often challenging, but it had also been profoundly meaningful. Maria's story demonstrated that individual actions, guided by professional values and personal courage, could create opportunities to serve others and influence systems in ways that extended far beyond their immediate circumstances. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.